For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Castanet, and today we're going to be talking about Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. These verses cover the opening of the second seal, which coincides in time with about the period from 3000 to 2000 BC. It also includes the period of the universal flood in the days of Noah, which coincidentally must have been a rather traumatic event for the people that lived in that time, but it was also a traumatic event in my life that I have to tell you about as we begin. So today's podcast is just going to be filled with all kinds of trauma, and when I say trauma, I'm not just being a drama mama either. This had to do with the first talk that I gave in a sacrament meeting in Saratoga, Wyoming. And I was just a kid, and it must have been that my uncle Jim was in the branch presidency, because he was in charge of coming up with the talks for Sunday church. And I mean, he must have been procrastinating a little bit, because it's like the day before, and we're out in the hayfield, and he's talking about, I need somebody to give some talks in church tomorrow. You know, this is one of those occasions when my big mouth gets me into trouble, because we're all standing around talking about what the potential topics could be. And I said, I could give a talk on Noah's Ark. And the only thing that I really knew about Noah's Ark was we had this old vinyl record that had an act by Bill Cosby where he was talking about Noah's Ark. And it starts out with, you know, some introductions, and then Noah gets his first vision, and it goes, voopa, 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 Noah kind of perks up, and you know, this is what you kind of envision, because we're just listening to it on vinyl. It's not like it's a video or something like that. But as soon as this ping, then you hear Noah, and then finally this voice says, "It's the Lord, Noah," and Noah says, "Right." So that's what I knew. That's the experience I had with Noah's Ark. But my big mouth says, I'll give a talk on Noah's Ark like Bill Cosby. And my uncle took me up on the deal and said, well, you can give a talk on Noah's Ark, but it's not going to be the Bill Cosby version. So at any rate, the next day at church, I kind of had this out-of-body experience, because I'm giving my talk. I was so nervous because, you know, I really didn't know much about Noah and the Ark. You know what you know, a little bit obviously, but the details and making it meaningful. So I was so nervous, and, you know, my talk was broken up and stuff like this, and I'm seeing myself out of body, and my sister Shelley got the other talk that had to be given. And she's sitting behind me, and I can just hear her laughing. and people out in the congregation, because I'm so nervous, of course, they're getting nervous. And everybody in the whole meeting is just sweating. At any rate, so at one point, I was just so upset with Shelley because she was behind me laughing. I turned around and used the S word. And I told her to shut up. Right there in this sacrament meeting in the branch. And so that's what I remember about my first experience giving a talk in a sacrament meeting in the little town of Saratoga, Wyoming, and my first real experience that I can remember with Noah's Ark. So I'm going to try and do better today on this podcast. You know, somehow, some way, I don't feel quite as nervous. Maybe it's because I can't see anybody. But at any rate, so today in this podcast, we're going to talk about Noah's Ark and how that fits into the second seal that John sees here in the book of Revelation. And because this seal is going to go fairly quickly, one of the things that I wanted to do that we're going to have a little fun with is I want to go back and talk about the mechanics of the flood in the days of Noah. And when I say flood, of course, I'm talking about the middle name of Fred Randall's Chinese neighbor. So that's the kind of fun we're going to be having today. And the mechanics of the flood, I'm going to talk about some of the physical laws that existed. And in order to do this, we're going to have to go back all the way to the creation, because the flood happened because of the physical and geological conditions at the end of the creative period. And it was a catastrophe just waiting to happen, as we will learn as we kind of go through this. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's jump right in and talk about Revelation chapter 6 verse 3, that says, quote, "And when he had opened the second seal, I heard the second beast say, 'Come and see.'" Now, you've already listened to my podcast from Revelation 6, 1 through 2. We talked about the first seal being opened and the first beast saying, "Come and see." So this is a kind of repetitious of what we've already talked about, but essentially you're going to get Jesus Christ, who's the Lamb of God, who's going to open the second seal in order to reveal the redemptive works of his during the second millennium, as I mentioned, from about 3000 to 2000 BC. And as always, there are a number of scholars who kind of misinterpret this meaning because they don't recognize the proper time frame. And just I'll give you one example of this by someone who I really respect as a theologian. His name is Albert Barnes. He wrote a 14-volume commentary on the entire Bible. And so he's well studied and well read, and he lived in the time period from about 1798, died in 1870. So he's right at the end of the period of the Reformation and during the time that the gospel is being restored upon the earth. But this is what he said with regard to the second seal. Quote, "In inquiring now into the period referred to by this symbol, we naturally look to what immediately succeeded the one which was represented by the opening of the first seal, that is, the period which followed the accession of Commodus in AD 180. Close quote. So, as you can see, he's a little bit off in his timing and trying to identify something that would correlate to what he's seeing with this red horse that we're going to be talking about here in just a minute. But he puts it in the time frame of 180 AD, which missed the mark by several thousand years. But at any rate, that's just one illustration. There are many out there that fail to recognize the proper timing of it. We have here the second beast, of course, that is speaking to John. The second beast is probably the beast that had the face of a calf or an ox. This assumes, of course, that things go in order from the way that the four beasts were listed in Revelation chapter 4, that began first with the face of a lion, then an ox, then a man, and then a flying eagle. And so if they go in order, then it's basically the calf or the ox that is up to bat. So the reality of it is that, as I said in the last podcast, it doesn't really make too much difference which of the beasts was kind of inviting the opening of the seal. The seal has its meaning, and it has its meaning regardless of who is inviting the Savior to open the particular seal. And again, as I mentioned in the last podcast, when the second beast says, "Come and see," a lot of the manuscripts would indicate that it's just the beast saying, "Come." But the bottom line is, it is a directive for John to come and look upon the image that gives the symbolic character of this horse and rider representing events in the second millennium of time, which of course covers the period of Noah's life and the universal flood. So just to kind of put some time periods in perspective here, by the time Noah was born, Adam had been dead for about 126 years. That's not that long in the grand scheme of things. Also, the city of Enoch had been translated 4 years before Noah was born. So keep in mind, we have the city of Enoch being translated. The flood itself is going to occur when Noah is 600 years old. So the city is translated about 4 years before Noah is born, and then for the next 596 years waiting for the actual flood to occur, we have a lot more people being translated during that period of time. And so what happens is, by the time of the flood, you have all the good guys that have been translated and taken up, and all of the really, really bad guys are the ones that are still hanging out, and they're going to be part of this traumatic event come 600 years after the birth of Noah. And so then in Genesis 9, verse 29, it says, quote, "And all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died." Close quote. So he's 600 years old at the time of the flood. He lives for another 350 years, and then he too passes away. And so the earthly conditions, it's important to note, are going to typify the conditions that existed just before the second coming. And so what we're going to see is this big polarization of people here in the last days. We're going to have some really good people, and we're going to have some really bad people. The really good people are not going to be translated as they were in the days of Enoch, but we're going to have the city of Zion here upon the earth, and that's going to be a place of protection. It's going to be a place where people can stand in holy places, and the Lord will preserve Zion on earth as he preserves Zion in heaven. But a couple of verses of scripture that talk a little bit about these conditions that existed in the days of Noah and how they correspond to and typify events here in the last days can be found in Moses 8, chapter 8, verses 22 through 30, where it says, quote, "God saw that the wickedness of men had become great in the earth, and every man was lifted up in the imagination of the thoughts of his heart, being only evil continually. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence, and behold, I will destroy all flesh from off the earth." Close quote. And then if we kind of fast forward here to the time of the Savior in Matthew chapter 24, this was, of course, the chapter that occurs on the eve of his crucifixion. And so in verses 37 through 39, it says this, quote, "But as the days of Noah were, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days that there were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and knew not until the flood came, and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be." Close quote. So here you see this direct correlation. We got the verses that are talking about how evil-filled the world was, and then the Savior on the eve of his crucifixion prophesying about his second coming and saying, remember what it was like in the days of Noah, that's what it's going to be like at the time of the second coming. Bruce R. McConkie said this, quote, "Suffice it to say that the era from 3000 BC to 2000 BC was one of war and destruction." Close quote. Now, if we take that information and we kind of put it into the context of the symbolic images that we read about here in Revelation chapter 6, we have to recognize that the symbolism in verse 4 that we're about to look at is going to dualistically describe events that existed in the time of the second millennium, or just before the flood, and then the second coming. So Neal A. Maxwell said this, quote, "We are told that some conditions preceding the second coming of the Savior will be as in the days of Noah." And he's citing to Matthew 24 that I just quoted. "And also, as it was in the days of Lot. Noah's time was one of disobedience and wickedness. Two especially interesting words are used in the Bible to describe Noah's time: violence and corruption. Violence and corruption, seldom strangers to the human scene, appear to be increasing today." Close quote. Now the reference here, of course, to the days of Lot, you have to recognize that that was Abraham's nephew. He traveled together with Abraham to the land of Canaan, and Lot lived in the days of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he and his wife lived in one of those cities. And of course, you know the whole story about how Lot was told, you need to get out of Sodom, and his wife looked back, etc., etc., and the rest is history, so to speak. Bruce R. McConkie also had this to say, quote, "In our day, peace has been taken from the earth, and the devil has power over his own dominion, with the result that soon the vineyard shall be cleansed by fire, Need we suppose it was any different in Noah's day, when the devil, raging in the hearts of men, caused the Lord in his anger to cleanse the vineyard with water? And so did he in 2348 BC. Close quote. Okay, so that's a little bit of the context leading up to the actual symbolism that we then find in Revelation chapter 6, verse 4, which says, quote, "And there went out another horse that was red, and power was given to him that sat thereon to take peace from the earth, that they should kill one another. And there was given unto him a great sword." Close quote. Now, having gone through the history of what conditions were like in the days of Noah and the parallel or typological conditions that will exist here in this day, now that we read this verse, wow, it could be describing either, basically. But again, the focus here in Revelation 6:4 is, of course, to describe events of the second seal, which just foreshadows what's going to happen and is starting to happen already in our day. So looking at the specific images, we've got this red horse. It's a fiery red color. In Greek, it would be puros. And this fiery red horse denotes bloodshed, slaughter, and death. So that is, the rider brings death through violence, bloodshed, carnage, warfare. And whenever I think of the word carnage, I always think of the movie Babe, right? And you've got that rooster, the goose, who was trying to be a rooster so that he would have a purpose, right? And so the goose had figured out that the only purpose that the goose really has is to be a dinner on Christmas Day, whereas things like chickens give eggs, and the rooster gets up in the roost, stands on the roof in the morning and crows to let everybody know they need to wake up. And so you've got the goose who's imitating the rooster, crowing up on the roof because he wants to have a purpose. And if he doesn't have a purpose, then, as he says, Christmas is carnage. So that's essentially what we're dealing with here in the second seal. Now we have to contrast the fiery red horse of the second seal with the white horse of purity and triumph in the first seal, which represented Enoch and his righteous triumphs over evil in that. And kind of the tables are pretty much reversed. And the reason is, of course, is because Enoch triumphs. The city of Enoch is taken up and translated, leaving all the bad guys. And so now we go from a condition of white to this condition of red and bloodshed, and ultimately then the destruction of almost all people and creatures on the earth. And that's the color that we associate with red. Coincidentally, the planet Mars, which is the red planet, is so called for the Roman god of war. So there's that connection. I know you were just waiting to have that little tidbit of information added to this very fun podcast that we're having today. So the color also, of course, represents sin. This we see in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 18, where it says, quote, "Come now and let us reason together, saith the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they shall be as white as snow. Though they be red like crimson, they shall be as wool." Close quote. And if you compare all of this with the other puros, or red, that we get in Revelation chapter 12, verse 3, we have the description of the dragon that John saw in the premortal existence, where he said, quote, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon." Close quote. Okay, so the other thing that is symbolic, of course, of war would be the horse itself. But that goes along with the other symbolism that we see in this rider, who's carrying a great large sword, which is also, of course, going to be a symbol of war. That is a weapon that is designed expressly to take human lives. And if you kind of compare this red and this sword to the second coming, we see that Christ will come in red clothing. And this is first described in Isaiah chapter 63, verses 2 and 3. It says, quote, "Wherefore art thou red in thine apparel, and thine garments like him that treadeth in the wine vat? I have trodden the winepress alone, and of the people there is none with me. For I will tread them in mine anger, and trample them in my fury. And their blood shall be sprinkled upon my garments, and I will stain all my raiment." So close quote. So here we have these symbols that are very much in parallel, but the red, of course, then serves as a symbol of judgment, which ultimately is what the whole flood was in the time of Noah, a judgment upon the wicked people that existed in that day and age. And Joseph Fielding Smith had this to say about the kind of things we're experiencing, what we're seeing even today again, as in the past. And he said, quote, "This earth is groaning today under the violence of corruption and sin. Wickedness is in the hearts of the children of men, and so it will continue according to the revelations of the Lord until that day when Christ shall come in the clouds of heaven, as he said, in red apparel, coming in the spirit of vengeance, to take vengeance upon the ungodly and to cleanse the earth from sin." Close quote. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about some of these other phrases that we see in Revelation chapter 6, verse 4. And among them it says, "Power was given to him," meaning the rider on the horse, "that sat thereon to take peace from the earth." So one of the things about this statement, it kind of assumes that a condition of peace and tranquility existed, because you got to have that condition in existence if it is then going to be taken from the earth. And so we had essentially this peace being taken really when the city of Enoch is translated and taken into heaven. And so once the city goes away, of course, the people that are left that are the really bad guys, that's when you no longer have peace. And so you have it in two aspects. One is you have the city of Enoch being taken up, but once it's gone, this goodness, you kind of take away the light, leaving spiritual darkness. Things just really start to get really ugly, and they deteriorate very quickly. And so Kent Jackson had this to say, quote, "In the days that followed the translation of the city of Enoch, the choice for all people was to join Zion or remain in the world. While Enoch and the saints succeeded in establishing a community of peace on the principles of faith and righteousness, the people of the world continued in their unrepentant ways and reaped a harvest of sorrow and destruction." Close quote. Which then leads in, of course, to the next part of this verse in chapter 6, where it says, "They shall kill one another." And so with only the wicked people left on earth after Zion fled, they begin to kill one another. And in the Greek, this idea of killing one another comes from the Greek phrase allos sphaxosin, which means an international and civil strife both, okay, which means that essentially they have no restraints in the indulgence of their lusts, passions, and desire for bloodshed. We think about the Lamanites and the Nephites who are fighting one another just for the sake of bloodshed. It's just something about it, and how Mormon and Moroni describe just the bloodlust that existed, when we had the complete destruction of the Nephite people after the year 400 AD. And so that's essentially what was happening here in the period of the second seal. Now, Joseph Seiss, who is a biblical theologian, not a member of the church, had this to say, quote, "The picture is particularly terrific. It represents not only disturbance of the relation of nations, the rising of nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, but internecine collisions, civil wars, the murderous hate of one portion of citizens exercised against another portion, and bloody commotions all over the face of society, having no issue but wretchedness and depopulation." Close quote. Even as we have this wicked slaying of the wicked before the flood in the days of Noah, we're going to have the same conditions that will exist before the second coming. And this is reflected in Doctrine and Covenants section 45, verse 33, where it says, quote, "And there shall be earthquakes also in diverse places and many desolations. Yet men will harden their hearts against me, and they will take up the sword one against another, and they will kill one another." Close quote. This then leads us to another phrase in chapter 6, verse 4, where it says, "There was given unto him a great sword, This, of course, represents the kind of wickedness and violence of the second seal that then ends with the entire loss of nearly all life during the universal flood. And according to the Bishop Ussher chronology, this occurred in approximately 2349 BC. And so the sword that we're talking about here symbolizes the slaughter among and between wicked people, and is an emblem of war, authority, judgment. And so if you fast forward into the time of the Roman Empire and the symbolism of the sword during that time period, it was a time around 27 BC-ish when only the highest military officials actually wore swords. In other words, they alone had the weapons carry permits, right? But in the imperial period, which comes later on, after 27 BC and really kind of up to and including 400, which is the time we would call the imperial period, the emperors began to wear daggers as a sword, and a sword as a badge of their office. So in the Latin phrase, you have the ius gladi, which means the right of the sword. And so the sign of the power or imperial power of the Caesars, that would be represented as a sword, and it essentially was the power to execute capital punishment. And Joseph Seiss, who I quoted just a moment ago, has this to say in terms of the symbolism. He said, quote, "A great and terrible weapon is also put into his hand, not the ordinary sword of war, which is the rhomphaia, which is that the Greek term, but machiria megali, a great sword of one having the power of life and death, and the result of his presence is war, much taking of life by public executions and mutual killing among men," close quote. And so essentially this is what we're talking about here, is this great sword. It's not just the common ordinary sword. So yes, that was occurring. You had a lot of bloodshed, people killing people, but this great sword is an emblem that is in the hand of the Father, who has the final say that results in the destruction of virtually all life here upon the earth. And this machiria, which is this Greek sword that we're talking, it has this long curved blade. And so it then becomes a symbol of the Lord's deadly judgments carried out by the flood. And Isaiah talks about this in 34:5, where he said, quote, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea and upon the people of my curse to judgment." Now, Isaiah obviously lived in the days after the flood, and he's speaking here prophetically of how it's going to be with this sword that is bathed in heaven at the time of the second coming. But as we said, that's the antitype for the type that then existed in the days of the flood of Noah. And the idea that you have a sword bathed in heaven means that it is either anointed or it's a representation of being drunk to the fill. And this word Idumea is used here as a symbol of the world or the people of the world. So this image is used to describe the judgments of the second coming. And this we see reflected also in Revelation 19:21, where John said, quote, "And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceedeth out of his mouth," close quote. That's describing the remnant who gets slain at the time of the second coming. Now, there's some question I suppose we could ask about who is the actual rider on this horse, because some have said, it could be the devil himself. And so Bruce R. McConkie is one of these, who said, quote, "Who rode the red horse? The red horse of war and bloodshed and a sword during the second seal. Perhaps it was the devil himself, for surely that was the great day of his power, a day of such gross wickedness that every living soul, save 8 only, was found worthy of death by drowning, which wickedness caused the Lord God of heaven to bring in the floods upon them," close quote. Now, it doesn't really matter whether it is or not. We had in the first seal, of course, the rider represented Enoch, and so we kind of try and personify the symbol and who is this guy really. And it's possible that it could be the devil, it could be something else or some instrumentality. I mean, we have Cain, who is still upon the earth, and as near as I can tell, he was still alive at the time of the flood, and died in the flood. And so it could be a personification of him. And we're going to talk more about Cain in later podcasts as Master Mayhem. So having gone through these verses now, I want to shift gears here a little bit, and let's talk about the mechanics of the flood. Now, keep in mind, I'm only going to be able to give you the most brief of overviews in terms of everything that transpired with the what I call the mechanics of the flood. But if you're going to understand the mechanics, the geology, the physical conditions that existed to allow the flood to happen, because it proceeded according to physical laws. It's not like the Lord just created out of nothing all the water that was necessary to flood the entire world and these kinds of things. These conditions had to be kind of put together and put in place at the time of the creation, just waiting for the day when the Lord would allow the actual flood to come upon the earth. So that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to go back to the creation now and talk a little bit about the creative processes that occurred according to physical laws that are eternal in their nature in order to have this earth created. Now, I think there is general agreement that the creation of the earth, the physical creation we're talking about, obviously, occurred via what we call accretion. And that is that the physical elements are gathered together by a process, and that process can still be observed even today. We see in the case of meteorites that fall to the earth. That's the process that occurred. You start bringing together these materials because they kind of come together, and as they come together through gravitational forces, and the bigger the object gets, the greater the gravitational force, and the bigger the gravitational force is, of course, the more stuff that it's going to start to draw into itself. And so Elder B.H. Roberts had this to say about this particular subject matter. He said, quote, "I believe the account in the first chapter of Genesis could be safely accepted as the announcement of the general plan of creation, not only of our planet, but of all worlds, and in it will be found ample scope for the belief that the earth came into existence, as our scientists insist, by the accretion of nebulous matter," close quote. All right, so here we have the concept of accretion, which is the bringing together of physical elements, and as they come together, essentially you have these heterogeneous materials coming together through gravitational forces. Now, the process of accretion generates a lot of heat, because as these rub your hand together just like I'm doing here for just a second. With that little bit of pressure in your hand, just rubbing together for a second, you can immediately feel how heat is generated. Well, think of these massive objects that come colliding into each other, and as they do so and they rub together, and the friction just causes this massive amount of heat. And so as they come together, they're initially kind of in a heterogeneous mass, but as they melt, you've got all of these heterogeneous materials that then start to become homogeneous. And we also then get the spherical shape due to the gravitational forces. So an earth or a world begins to form as a spherical object because it's in a molten state. And you've got things like hydrogen, helium, water, and other gases. They're all coming together with the other physical elements. And with regard to the form of the earth, Elder Roberts added the quote, "The globular form of the earth is also looked upon as evidence of its original fluidity," close quote. So the scriptures sometimes refer to the earth that existed in its primal state as the deep and the waters. Scientists would call it a magma ocean. Now, the Earth's core, scientists today estimate is somewhere around 5,000 degrees centigrade. And probably that on day one of the creation was also what the Earth's outer surface must have been like. All this magma ocean, just very, very, very hot. And that's day one of the creation. And all these materials, including all the water, everything we're going to need eventually for this flood to happen, it's right there on day one. Now, what we need to follow that then is a cooling down. And so when you think of going from the first day to the second day, we have this night in between them. And I think that's good symbolism, and there's a reality to it as well, where you have the night of the first day, you're going to have this cooling down period, and it's going to be this extreme cold, because what you have is this very hot molten earth that otherwise exists. You don't have any influence from the sun, you don't have any other body that is contributing to the heat of this earth that has just been created, and so it's in the extreme cold in the darkness of space. And how cold is that? It's basically about negative 270 degrees centigrade, right? It's just slightly colder than the winters that you have in Wyoming. At least that's how I felt growing up as a kid. But at any rate, as you get this coldness in the night of the first day, you have the crystallization process that begins as the earth begins to cool from outside to inside. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting, because there's this smart guy who's a scientist. His name was Norman L. Bowen, and he did some experiments in the early 1900s that determined how minerals crystallize. And he looked at things like the pressure, he looked at things like temperature, and he discovered that as minerals grow, and they do grow, as they go from a liquid state to a solid state. And so even though they're inorganic, they can grow. And the growth size and the type of thing that they grow into is going to depend on their chemical composition, temperature, and pressure. Those are the main things that are happening. So in these experiments done by Mr. Bowen, he was looking at how the different temperature ranges affect the formation of minerals from magma. And his results are called the Bowen's reaction series. So what he determined was that some igneous rocks, in other words, volcanic rocks that come from magma, which are igneous, they crystallize at a high temperature of about 1400 degrees centigrade, which is about 2552 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, just to give you some context here, when you have erupting lava, that is molten magma, the temperatures usually exceed about 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. So essentially at the beginning point, you have this very hot earth on day one. It begins to cool, and then what's going to happen is when it gets down to about 1400 degrees centigrade, which is, again, lower than this hot lava, because that hot lava spewing out of volcanoes even today is still above that 1400 degrees centigrade range, because it's still molten. It's not getting hard. But as soon as it starts to drop below 1400 degrees centigrade, then it's going to start to cool enough that it can begin to crystallize and get hard. And so there are some igneous rocks, and they differ. Some rocks are going to, and some minerals will crystallize at 1400 degrees, but other types will crystallize at a lower temperature. So you have to get them even cooler if you're going to form a different type. So all of these processes are going. So then we kind of get into this question among scientists in the creation as to how long it took for the earth to crystallize and to get hard from its molten condition. And this is where we get a lot of the scientists that differ with the creationists and people who believe in the creation in a fairly fast cooling process, because they try and look at this kind of on statistics. They create models to figure out how long would it take to cool down the earth if it's in this molten condition, and get it to the point that essentially what we say. And they of course come up with thousands and thousands and millions of years of what it would take. But a lot of their assumptions are they fail to recognize that magma, when it was cooling in the earth, there was a convection process going on. So that it's not like the magma just sat there and by conduction you have this kind of cooling. When you think of a convection, you think of the convection ovens. You might think of your air fryer that circulates air. That's cooks things really fast because it's cooking through convection by the movement of the hot air through that, or your oven, or whatever it might be. Now, if you take the same heat and you don't have the convection, that is the movement of the air, then you have conduction heating, and it takes a lot longer. Well, the same process is true of cooling, that if you have magma that's very, very hot, and on the outside of the Earth itself, you have the cold of outer space, this negative 270 degrees centigrade compared to 500 degrees centigrade on the plus side. You put those two together and you have the magma circulating. Why? Because as it gets cold, it sinks, and then hot comes to the surface. And so you have these big plumes of circulating magma coming up to the surface, getting cold, takes it back down. And so it's a very, very fast cooling process that is actually beginning. And W. Kenneth Hamlin, who wrote the Earth's Dynamic Systems as a book that is in use at BYU, he said, quote, "Transmission of heat energy by the rise of buoyant hot material and the sinking of cold material," close quote. So that's how he defines convection, and in the context of the cooling of magma. So here you have the magma getting cold up at the surface, it crystallizes, it sinks back down, starts to melt again as it goes down, gets reheated, and so you got these convection currents kind of going. I got my hand going in a circular motion if you're just listening to this, to describe how the convection currents are occurring on day one. Now what happens is, as magma cools, it also expels large quantities of dissolved water. Now, when we say dissolved water, we all recognize that water in its fluid or ice form, even water vapor, is composed of hydrogen and oxygen. So you have 2 parts hydrogen, 1 part oxygen. You put them together, boom, thank you very much, we have water. Well, when they're dissolved, you just have these parts, and they're floating around in the magma, but as it begins to cool, they start to come together and form water particles, and so you get this large quantity of what was dissolved water coming together, and then it gets expelled from the magma as the magma begins to cool. And so water and other things then become these byproducts, if you will, of this magma ocean that existed on day one of the creation. And so Kenneth Hamlin had this to say, quote, "Water vapor and carbon dioxide are the principal gases dissolved in magma. More than 90% of the gas emitted from hot magma is water, that is H2O, and carbon dioxide, CO2. Together, these volatiles materials that are readily vaporized to form gas at Earth surface conditions usually constitute from 0.1% to 5% by weight, but may reach concentrations as high as 15% in some silicate magmas," close quote. So we then kind of ask the question, how much water was in the magma ocean on day one of the creation? And this was something that was the subject of a scientific study where it says, quote, "The mass of the Earth is 5 times 10 to the 27th gram. The mass of one Earth ocean is 1.4 times 10 to the 24th gram. The extreme maximum estimates for the amount of water in the Earth is about 50 Earth oceans, with most estimates being 10 Earth oceans or less. For example, an estimate based on water storage potential of minerals in the silicate Earth is about 5 to 6 oceans," close quote. So when we think of Earth oceans, we're thinking about the oceans that exist on the Earth today. Now, we have lots of magma still in the Earth, right? It's still, the Earth is huge. Sometimes it's pretty amazing when you contemplate just how massive it is when we're talking about these things. But if you were to take essentially all the magma below the Earth's crust, going all the way down to the core, and you were to crystallize it the way the crust has been crystallized. They're saying basically the amount of water that you have in the oceans today, this one Earth oceans, you'd have 5 or 6 more that could be filled with all the water that's still left in the magma that has yet to crystallize on the inside of the Earth. So essentially, there's lots and lots of water in the magma ocean that has yet to crystallize, enough to fill about 5 or 6 oceans. So those are the conditions on day 1 and the cooling process as we go into day 2 of the creation. Now, day 2 of the creation is described, of course, in Genesis chapter 1, but there's a more detailed explanation in Moses chapter 2, verse 6, where we have this phrase, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the water." So we have to focus a little bit on what that means, but it's a very, very important part, an element, if you will, of how the flood came to exist in the days of Noah, because it all comes down to this firmament in the midst of the water. So in Moses chapter 2, verses 6, it kind of presupposes that we have the existence of a body of water in which a firmament was to be formed. So let's talk about that just for a moment, this body of water, because as I've mentioned, as magma cools, it's going to begin to expel water, and so that water is then going to come to the surface. Why? Because water is less dense than rock. And so as water is expelled from the magma, the heavier rock that is being crystallized is lower and the water comes to the surface. All right. And so keeping in mind, this is consistent with this concept of how the earth is born, because we think of the earth as this living thing. And guess what? Even as humans are born in the water of the amniotic fluid in the mother's womb, so the earth also kind of was born and came forth out of what we'd say was amniotic fluid, or the water that covered the earth in its entirety. And so in the sense that the earth was born of the water, it will be baptized in water, it will die and resurrect, all of these giving an indication of how the earth is a very living thing. It complies with the requirements of the gospel in terms of its own baptism, death, and resurrection, things of this type. Now, Joseph Fielding Smith talked about this when he said, quote, "The first ordinance instituted for the cleansing of the earth was that of immersion in water. It was buried in the liquid element, and all things sinful upon the face of the earth were washed away. As it came forth from the ocean floor, like the newborn child, it was innocent. It rose to newness of life. It was in its second birth from the womb of the mighty waters, a new world issuing from the ruins of the old, clothed with the innocence of this first creation." Close quote. And there he's citing to Elder Orson Pratt in the Journal of Discourses. So President Smith is talking here both about the fact that the earth was born of water in the day of its creation, and then in newness of life, or in its rebirth, it was baptized, which occurred in the days of the flood, when it was again had the entire physical, the rocky or earthy part of the earth that was below the surface of the water, only then to emerge in kind of a newness of life. And so all of this is all what's going on here. So getting back to the first birth, we have this shallow ocean of water on the first night, where water has been expelled from the crystallizing igneous rock that is forming under the surface, and we have then water, and we have the firmament below that water, all below the surface. And so when we say that this was a shallow ocean of water, it's probably about half or 1/4 of all the water that we see in the oceans today. That's the type of water that was on the earth, and the earth was essentially still without form. It was void. In other words, there was no topography. There's no hills really, and mountains to speak of that could come up above it. But there's still a lot of things happening below the surface of the earth as this cooling process continues. And this is then what we get described in Moses chapter 2, verses 6 through 8, where it says this, quote, "And again, I, God, said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the water, and it was so, even as I spake. And I said, Let it divide the waters from the waters, and it was done." Notice we're now getting a division in these waters. "And I, God, made the firmament, and divided the waters, yea, the great waters under the firmament, from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so, even as I spake. And I, God, called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." Close quote. Now there's actually three things happening in this verse, or in these several verses, 6 through 8. You have one, you have the firmament in the midst of the waters. That is, you're going to have solid crystallized rock beneath the surface of the watery ocean. And keep in mind, as I mentioned, water has a density of just 1 gram per centimeter cube. So it's pretty light compared to the rock being heavier, but not all rocks are made equal. Okay, they don't all have the same density. So the firmament that we're essentially talking about here, we typically refer to it as basalt. And this is what a lot of people would describe as the oceanic crust. So if you look at the crust underneath the oceans in the world today, what you're going to see is a rock that is called basalt or gabbro, depending on some of the crystallization that occurs. Now, this oceanic crust is somewhere between 5 and 10 kilometers in thickness. That is about 3 to 6 miles. This particular rock has a density of 2.9 grams per centimeter cube, which is significantly heavier or more dense than water at 1 gram per centimeter. That's why the rocks are at the bottom, water is on top. Now, you ask the question, well, why do we have the basalt being formed? Why does that happen to be the rock with this particular density that forms the oceanic crust? And it goes back to Bowen's reaction series, because he discovered that by doing temperature ranges and figuring out when rocks crystallize at various temperatures, that the first rock to crystallize at the highest temperature is going to be basalt. By contrast, granite crystallizes at a lower temperature. And granite forms kind of from minerals that are left over after the basalt has formed. So in the Bowen reaction series, you got basalt kind of up here at the top, using up minerals and things like that coming together to form basalt. The stuff that's left over that is not going to harden until it gets cooler is the stuff then that forms this granite. And it has a density of 2.7 grams per centimeter cube. In other words, if you compare, I'll call it the weight, but really it's the density, the weight or density of basalt, basalt is actually heavier than granite. So if it was fluid, the basalt would always flow down below the granite would flow up, and then the water would be up at the top. Okay, so I'm going to come back to that in just a second, but keep those concepts in mind as we continue to talk about these firmaments in the water. So the first thing that happens in Moses 2, verses 6 through 8, is we're going to have a firmament in the midst of the waters. And it's going to divide the waters from the waters. Now, what does that mean? That's the second thing that happens. Because the reason it happens is because you get the formation of the basalt and this water ocean, this watery ocean above it, that happens first. But as the rock, the magma below this basalt layer continues to get cooler, it's going to start outgassing water as well. So you're going to have water, then you're going to have the basalt or the oceanic crust, but below it, as it continues to cool, it also is creating more water, and that water is going to rise to the surface, but it can't go all the way to the surface because we now have this hard crust of basalt on the earth, and so that water gets trapped beneath the oceanic crust or this basalt. So now we have the waters being divided by the firmament. You have the water on top, which is real water, then you have the basalt, then we have more water because of the granite that is still cooling down below, and the temperatures as they continue to get lower. And then that then takes us to the third thing talked about in Moses chapter 2, and this is in verse 6 where he says, let's call the firmament heaven. All of a sudden we have now left the earth, and we get this third aspect of a firmament, that is the firmament of heaven. Now the firmament of heaven is something that's very Jewish, okay? It's very ancient. They have this concept that in the heavens surrounding the earth there is this firmament that divides what would be the atmospheric heaven from this thing that exists beyond, the stars and the planets and, you know, stuff that we would call outer space. And they saw that there was this sort of firmament. That's why in things like the book of Malachi, where it says, I'm going to open you the windows of heaven and pour you out this blessing. Well, you got to have a window in heaven because it's firm. So you got to open a window, pour out the blessings. And that's the concept. And so if you think about this a little bit, all of this is also described in terms of water vapor, okay? Because the atmosphere is full of water, right? It's just in a vapor form, and but it differs from the waters of the ocean that are very solid in their makeup, right? Now, if you go and you think about this a little bit, think about the instruction that we get in the temple as the periods of the creative processes are described, and particularly nowadays in the new temple instruction that we receive, it talks about this firmament of heaven on day 2. Well, that's what it's really talking about here, is what you find in Moses chapter 2, verse 8, that is describing the firmament of heaven. The temple isn't trying to explain all the geology that I'm playing. We only have a couple hours, right? So it's not like you can spend an hour talking about the second day of the creation, but what they focus on in the instruction is essentially the firmament of heaven. Okay, but there are these other aspects to these verses that I've described, because there's still a lot going on under the waters on earth that includes this oceanic crust and another layer of water, and then the granite down below that. Now, what happens sometime if we talk about this, I'm going to put up a slide here that is going to just kind of try and summarize what we have in terms of the firmaments, plural, that exists. So what you have, and this is essentially my summarization of the layers of water and firmaments going from top to bottom as explained in Moses chapter 2, verses 6 through 8. So you have 1, the firmament of heaven, that is the sidereal, an atmospheric boundary that is described in Moses 2:8. And then you have surface waters under heaven. This is that shallow ocean of water that existed as of day 2 of the creative process. Now, under the shallow ocean of water, you then have that first firmament, which I'm calling oceanic crust. It is the basalt. It has a density of 2.9 grams per centimeter cubed. That's what you see in Moses chapter 2, verse 6. Then under that oceanic crust, you have a subsurface water, or a subterranean ocean, if you will, below the oceanic crust. Now keep in mind, this water, it can't get up to the surface because we have a hard crust that is now formed. But the water has a density of 1 gram per centimeter cubed. Now what's wrong with this picture? The thing that's wrong with this picture is the lighter or less dense water is below the very heavy oceanic crust that is on top of it. So you have the oceanic crust basically floating, and it's like a water bed, right? If you lay down on your water bed, it's fine. You're more dense than the water that is below you, but the water can't get out because you have the seal of the water bed holding. But if you puncture that water bed and then you lay on it, then what do you have? You have a mess. That's what you have, and because that water comes spewing up, and you get all wet, and it goes out on your floor, and the insurance says, sorry, we don't cover waterbed damage, right? Okay, so that's essentially what we're talking about here, and the fact that you have the water that is less dense It's that way because it can't get to the surface unless that oceanic crust gets ruptured. Okay, and then finally, below that subterranean ocean, as I'm calling it, you have a firmament in the midst of the water. And this is the firmament that is below that subterranean ocean. This is what is eventually, as it continues to cool down, becomes the continental crust of the earth. That is granite. All right, and notice in the slide it is at 2.7 grams per centimeter cubed. So it too, if it's still in a molten state, it should rise above. And that's what we see in some of the volcanic activity that we see today, is what you're going to see coming up principally in these volcanoes. Well, not always, but most of the time it's going to be granite that comes up. From this igneous rock comes up, it's the granite. That's because that's still molten. Something breaks through that oceanic crust in the form of a volcano, forces itself up, and when it does, it creates that opening that allows this less dense granite to come up out. Now, if the granite weighed more than the oceanic crust, you wouldn't get this kind of activity, because the lighter granite wouldn't be trying to push its way up above something that was lighter than it was. But since the basalt, the oceanic crust, is heavier, it's pushing down on the subsurface waters, on the continental crust of granite. It's all pushing down, and the lighter stuff wants to come to the surface. Okay, so that's what we have. That's the dynamics. That's the geology that exists after the first day and going into the second day of the creation. Now, keep in mind, this is a very, very simplified view. These things just aren't that simple, and I kind of alluded to that with this idea of volcanic activity. Things change and things happen because of this. But essentially, this all then gives us the conditions that can exist for the flood in the days of Noah. And what you should learn from everything that I've talked about so far, if your eyes aren't spinning, is essentially after day 2, the conditions of the earth, geologically speaking, were inherently unstable. It was only a matter of time before that subterranean ocean, those waters below that oceanic crust, were going to rupture. There was going to be a rupture at some point in time. And when that happens, all of those waters that are below the surface, that first firmament, oceanic crust, they're going to come up. The oceanic crust is going to push down, and there are going to be massive changes that are going to occur on the earth. And this is all explained in detail by Walt Brown in his book called In the Beginning. It's in its 8th edition, and he has what is known as the hydroplate theory for explaining how the flood occurred. And he picks up, basically, I've described to you the geology that existed at the time of the creation. He then takes it, and I'm kind of plagiarizing his theory here a little bit to go from, now that the conditions have been shown, his theory, known as the hydroplate theory, then explains things very well. So essentially what you have, I'm going to put up an image here that's taken from his book that kind of shows the flood mechanism. And so you can see the what I've described previously as this subterranean ocean beneath the first firmament of oceanic crust, and you can see how you at some point in time, and again we know the timing of it, you're going to get this little rupture. And think about it in these terms. If you were to drill a little hole, go to Hoover Dam, and down toward the bottom of the dam, if we were to just take a 1/2-inch drill bit and drill through the concrete, through from one side going into the other, I bet you could not get that drill bit all the way through Hoover Dam to the surface to see this little pinhole of water coming out before the pressure of that water in that dam would be so great that before you could even create the entire hole, it would start pushing back and opening that up. And as water flows through this little pinhole at just tremendous speed, it starts carrying with it all of the little concrete on the side, and it starts chipping that hole, and before you know it, it's a 1-inch hole. It's a 2, and soon the whole thing just collapses. That's essentially what's happening here in the flood. It all happened according to Genesis 7, verse 11, quote, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened." Close quote. So in that particular day is when you get this little rupture of the oceanic crust. So let's go back now to this image of the flood and the flood mechanism that I talked about a moment ago. You can see how essentially you have that subterranean ocean that, because of the pressure of the 2.9 gram per centimeter basalt pushing down on the 1 centimeter per gram, the 1 gram per cubic centimeter, pushing down on the water, that water wants to come up. All right, and so that's how the flood mechanism then occurs, and it all is based on how the earth came to exist, and it's all very consistent with physical law. Nobody could really dispute that that's the way the earth had to form according to physical laws of nature. Now, as explained by Dr. Brown in his book, in this next image that I'm showing you the image of how this little rupture that begins at one particular place then is going to chew away at that oceanic crust and creating this wide crevice that's going to open up, and then it's essentially going to circumnavigate the entire globe like the seams of a baseball, because what begins as kind of this microscopic breach then opens up everything, and the idea that he espouses here is that what you have is the forces that exist are so great that these massive quantities of the earth are being thrown out of the earth's atmosphere, and they become asteroids. We got an asteroid belt around the earth. Well, this would explain it. If you look at all of the moon and all the pockmarks, what look like craters in the moon, there's no evidence of any kind of volcanic activity. So how the heck did they get there? Well, his theory would explain it, that some of the projectiles leaving the earth left with such force and got beyond the atmosphere that they went and struck the moon. And that's how you get these kind of images on the moon. When you think about the earth and geology and all the sedimentary rock that exists on the earth, where did all those layers of sediment come from? Well, it would have come from the flood. All of this being chewed away, this water, this action of water from that subterranean ocean being forced up, and as it goes up the sides of the opening, just tearing away at all those igneous, once was igneous rocks of basalt, just being chewed up and ground up through these activities. You look at all of the round rocks. We live out in California and in the area of Folsom. If you go up in that area, there are just tons and tons of these nice round rocks, 6 inches, 8 inches, a foot in diameter, but they're not rough stones. They're all ground up like they've been in somebody's little rock thing that you polish rocks in. And why is that? Well, that's what would be consistent with what you get in the big flood, is you got this big gush of water causing those stones to come together and hit each other and smooth each other out, and all of these kinds of, so much is explained by this in terms of the flood and the effects of that subterranean water being leashed out. And so do we see signs that this is what actually occurred? In this next image, we're looking here at what is known as the North Atlantic Ridge, and this is from underwater surveys, where you can see how this ridge, what happens is that, and this is all part of the continental drift theories that exist today, that many scientists will say, well, the continents are drifting away from each other. That's taking so much, moving so much per year, that would take so much amount of time. Well, a lot of this happened very, very quickly with the flood, because when that oceanic crust that might have been, 3 to 6 miles thick, consider that, take 3 to 6 miles of sediment, even 1 inch, 2 inches, but we're talking miles. As this water is being forced up, that's where we get all the sediment, and as that water comes up, you've got the magma down below, it starts to also kind of bulge up, and that then becomes the North Atlantic Ridge that circumnavigates the entire Earth. And these are from underwater surveys, and so it's very consistent with what you would expect to see based on the theory that Dr. Brown has come up with. And so lastly, let's just throw up one more image just to kind of depict the continents, including the specific west and east hemispheres. Now, back in the 1800s, you had Alfred Wegener, who kind of theorized that at one point in time, all of the continents were together at the time of the creation, and he referred to them or called them Pangea, which means one earth. And we believe that too. It's a matter of scriptural doctrine that that's the way that it was. And so if you kind of compared the Western Hemisphere with the American continent on the left side and the Eastern continent or the Old World on the right, you can see they kind of match together. Well, that's where that seam at the time of the flood came through by this water and the oceanic subterranean ocean forcing itself up along that route and cleaning out the continental oceanic crust, and then eventually they start to split apart. And all this is consistent with the hydroplate theory and the sliding of the hemisphere. So I've given you just kind of a thumbnail sketch. There's lots more details, and we could spend a ton more time. It's something that I'm particularly interested in. I find it very fascinating, but I think he got it right when I'm speaking of Dr. Brown. I think he got it right in terms of the how the flood affects what we see in geology today, and it's all consistent with the scientific laws that exist for the creation of the earth, as I've described it here in this podcast. So at any rate, that's kind of our introduction to the flood mechanism. For me, it was lots of fun. I hope it was fun for you too. If you want to get more details on the hydroplate theory, you can check out Walt Brown in the beginning. Just type in Walt Brown in the beginning, it'll pop up. His book is free online, so you can find the same images that I showed you in this podcast online. You can read more about the details of his theory. And so that brings us then to a conclusion of today's podcast. The next time we meet, we'll be talking about the third seal and the opening of the third seal, when we get a black horse and its rider coming on the scene in the period from 2000 to 1000 BC, and we'll talk about that. So thanks for joining me today. Thanks for listening, watching, sharing, subscribing. I look forward to seeing you again, and thanks to Jenna for all their technical help. See you next time.